the way in which gender is approached in even the issue, even when it is talked about. I think that women are talked about a lot more now in our media, even in our politics. But the framework through which it's approached is more one of protection. यानी महिलाओं के बारे में बात तो ज़्यादा हो रही है, लेकिन वो एक तरह से सुरक्षा की नज़र से सुरक्षा के फ्रेमवर्क में ही बातें हो रही है. तो इससे क्या रिपरकशंस हैं? What are the implications of talking about women through a framework of protection and security? Both the implications for talking about violence against women, but also what gets left out, what kinds of violence and what kinds of oppression actually manage to justify themselves or empower themselves by talking about protecting women. I thought that we could start by talking about that a little bit. Because you see, the whole idea is that the whole idea about protection is that sexual violence in particular is projected as the overwhelmingly largest threat to women. तो महिलाओं की सुरक्षा का मतलब है, महिलाओं को सिक्योरिटी का मतलब है बलात्कार से बचाना, protecting a woman from rape, and by rape is meant stranger rape, यानी कि सड़क पर अनजान व्यक्ति द्वारा कोई यौन हिंसा, इससे महिलाओं को बचाना. You have to protect women from the unknown stranger. So the problem with that framework right then and there is that even if you're talking about sexual violence, you are forgetting the fact you're able to displace, through this framework, you're able to displace the fact that much of sexual violence all over the world, not just in India, happens by persons who are known and trusted. So the perpetrators, the accused, tend to be people who are trusted, who are known. This goes for violence against children as well as violence against women, right? So the minute you talk about security in terms of keeping women secure from the violence they might face in the public sphere from strangers, you are immediately able to displace the entire discussion from where it really tends to happen. So that means that every time you have a public discussion, I can tell you a recent example of this also. You know, when he mentioned the 16th December thing and all of that, and that was one time when you had a lot of the media, some of it of course indulging in dreadful kinds of calls for castration and death penalty and so on. Even if you set aside those, even if you look at the saner channels, which were actually talking about, you know, all right, well, let's give a platform to the women's groups, let's listen to what are the things they are recommending. So I can tell you one of the things that happened at that time was that one of the channels, I don't count them among the saner ones, as Jane well knows, I was on a Times Now discussion. That was only the second time I'd ever been there. And the entire discussion, you had people, I don't remember all the panelists, but you had 3 women panelists who were all against the death penalty. And you had an array of male panelists who were all saying that the death penalty is the answer. And death penalty is the answer for rape, and you know, so we were being heckled. The women's rights activists, the women in the room, were being heckled and told, you know, you all don't want you're softies basically. You're not wanting to, you know, do the real manly thing of castrating rapists or hanging them in public or whatever it is that we used to be doing. तो आप नहीं कर रहे हो, आप तो क्या हो, बड़े बेकार हो. इसको लेकर के खूब हो रहा था. One of the panelists I remember was this person called Palash Krishna Mehrotra, I think his name is. Okay. Anyway, he's some ad man or something like that. So I later realized that, you know, this was when they were talking about December 16, जहाँ पे जो rape accused थे, they were slum dwellers and this and that. So they were strangers. Who cares about them? Nobody, you know, there was no agenda to rehabilitate them, right? And we, on the other hand, from the women's movement, were talking about the need for justice, which was a broader sense of justice, of gender justice, of course in sexual violence, but also in other forms of gendered violence. And we were continuously saying that this kind of framework where death penalty and whatnot, is talked about as the solution is absolutely useless, because it takes you away from really addressing what a survivor of violence requires in terms of justice, both institutionally, both what the state owes the survivor, but also in terms of what society owes the survivor and how society should conduct itself towards a survivor of violence. Now, one of the persons on that panel, when a very prominent editor of a magazine was accused of rape by a younger woman colleague, he wrote an article saying men are under siege. He was asking, the Justice Verma Commission that we managed to get in place did not recommend death penalty. But the law that was passed did implement death penalty. So it's a law which the women's groups are not saying this is our law and we love it. There's notes that we don't love about that law. But the point is that it did, some changes did come about in the law, whereby at least the framework where a patriarchal framework, where only a certain kind of violence is recognized as rape. So penetration by an object or penetration by any other part of the body except a male sexual organ is not recognized as rape. It was not recognized as rape till 2013, and we were saying that is because of the patriarchal understanding that rape is basically a taking away of women's potential marriageability, virginity, and it's creating the horrific possibility of the woman bearing a child, getting pregnant by someone who's an illicit sexual, through an illicit sexual encounter. So because rape was viewed in that framework, and that was how the rape law was drafted, you had this recognition. So you didn't recognize it as a violation of women's bodily integrity and autonomy, as a violation of her consent, that she hasn't consented and you forced her. So we were saying that any kind of, the definition of rape has to be broadened. So once it was broadened in the law, and you actually had not someone unknown, not a nameless person from a slum whom you don't have to bother about, but someone really whom these male opinion makers actually identified. I won't even say only male, patriarchal opinion makers identified with. They immediately began writing articles saying men are under siege, and saying in that article that he was forcing, he was penetrating her with a finger. So that is something submissive that he's doing. He's doing it for, it's a submissive gesture on part of the man. So how can you call it rape? So if there's nothing pleasurable in it for the man, apparently, so he was trying to give pleasure to the woman. So, as two feminists wrote in a recent article on the rape law, who's going to decide whether it is pleasurable, whether it is submissive and everything? It doesn't matter what the woman thinks. If she is, absolutely bored by you, or terrified by you, or afraid of you, or can't stand the sight of you, wants to throw up at the sight of you, doesn't matter. You are doing something. As a man who has the prerogative, the entitlement to decide. So this was the problem with the way that rape, even the question of sexual violence was being discussed. That when you really came to rape cases which did not involve graphic dismemberment, which are not cases in which you can profile the offenders and say, slum-dwelling migrant men tend to rape, or the ex-criminal tribes, Bavaria tribes in Bulandshahr tend to rape, or whatever it is. When you're not able to do that kind of profile, when you're forced to confront the fact that those who commit sexual violence could be those amongst you, amongst your own, those whom you consider your own circle, your own class, or even your own organization, and so on and so forth. The minute you are face to face with that situation, then you are unable to, you are unwilling to even recognize it as rape. You're going to say, ये बलात्कार नहीं है, ये है ही नहीं, क्योंकि बलात्कार तो वैसी चीज होगी जिसको हम समझते हैं, यानी बलात्कार की भी बिल्कुल पितृसत्तात्मक परिभाषा, और बलात्कार के लिए क्या सॉल्यूशन है उसके लिए भी पूरी तरह से पितृसत्तात्मक परिभाषा. So the solution for rape is patriarchal, and the definition of rape should remain patriarchal. So how to take it away from this framework is one of the things that women were grappling with. during that movement. So we were saying then that this, looking at it through the framework of protection causes other problems as well, which from day one in that movement also, what was most significant about that movement really was the fact that so many women, for the first time you found a visibility in an Indian political movement, Indian movement against sexual violence. And not only in India, I think it's pretty significant if you look at it from any perspective. The fact was that you had so many women coming out and talking about their autonomy and saying that the violation of our autonomy is something we don't want, don't take away. They were putting their finger on it when they were saying, don't take away our freedoms in the name of protecting us. This was something which resonated hugely there. When I said something about this in a speech, and several people saw that video of it, I was flooded with messages from young women saying, this is exactly what is happening today to us. That the rape in Delhi is being talked about, and our parents are saying, तुमको नहीं भेजेंगे पढ़ने के लिए. We don't want to send you to Delhi to study. We don't want to send you to Bombay to study. We don't want you to go outside. अगर आप दिल्ली में पढ़ रहे हो, कॉलेज जा रहे हो, कितने बजे लौट रहे हो? What time are you coming back? Where can we lock you up so that you will remain safe? Was what was happening, and so women found this not only frightening, but also it would deter them from talking about sexual violence that they faced. And this is something we have seen with women we have worked with down the years, especially women students, I can say, कि उनको लगता है कि मेरे साथ अगर कोई sexual harassment हुई है या rape हुआ है, मैं उसके बारे में अगर बोलूँगी कुछ, अगर मैंने बोल पहुँच गए, मेरे पेरेंट्स तक पहुँच गया, तो वो मेरी सुरक्षा के बारे में सोच करके मेरी पढ़ाई बंद कर देंगे. ये they will think that their parents, out of concern for their safety, will curtail their education and take them right out of it. This becomes one of the deterrents to why we won't talk about it. That is why in a recent campaign that we were conducting, Soch Badlo, Samaj Badlo in Delhi, one of the things that we would talk about to communities, to people, especially in working class localities where we had some very exciting conversations about this, we would ask them, what do you think? And they would say, Acha Suraksha, safety for women. If you would ask them, what do you mean by safety? And then this would come out, that the idea of safety is how to protect them from something that can happen to them, something bad that can happen. But when you point out that in fact, the fact that you are so willing and so ready and so quick to take away their freedoms the minute you out of the fear of sexual violence, that is going to in fact make your daughter or actually even more insecure, because in her school or in her college she's going to be that much more reluctant to actually come out and talk about it, right? So इसको लेकर के जब हम लोग बात करते थे तो ज़रूर लोग थोड़ा सोचते थे इस बारे में कि फिर ये ज़्यादा सुरक्षित कहाँ बना रही है, तो असुरक्षित बना रही है. Then the other thing, the other aspect of it which is not talked about, every time now, even after a few convictions have started trickling in, which are which are known and so on, you immediately started the bogey of saying how the rape law is being misused and the rape law is the rape law is threatening men and so on, as it happened with the dowry law, and which is the only law in India that has criminal sections for domestic violence. ये होने लग गया कि ये कानून गलत है, कानून का दुरुपयोग etc. ये शुरू हो गया. But the funny fact is that the real way in which the rape law is misused is something that is not talked about which there is a nearly complete silence, apart from a few really good journalists who have very few, I can count them, be less than 5 I would say, who would have actually talked about this or investigated it. There's no one talking about it very much except in the women's movement. That is the statistics of rape. Nowadays I've become very careful कि जब मैं rape statistics numbers के बारे में बोलती हूँ, I never go by the numbers that are quoted in the NCRB data or whatever data is available. Because based on that data, it's very quick, it's very easy. You take a calculator, you do it on your phone or whatever, and you say, okay, so many rape complaints, which means so many rapes an hour, this, that. And I am wary of doing that, because I say that the actual numbers we don't know, it could be much higher because rape is very underreported. But in the cases that are reported, there is a disproportionate number of cases of consensual sexual activity that are branded as rape by who? By the girl's parents. So you have the girl's parents saying that this is rape because the guy, you know, what is rape? Rape is, let's remember, rape is illicit sexual activity with somebody whom I don't want him to impregnate my daughter or take away her virginity or marry her because it will pollute my caste structure, whatever it is. इन सभी वजहों से बलात्कार क्या है? तो बलात्कार तुरंत कह देते हैं कि अगर लड़की प्यार करके शादी करने के लिए भाग गई या किसी के साथ रहने के लिए भाग गई तो तुरंत उसमें रेप की कंप्लेंट फाइल करना ये बिल्कुल कॉमन बात है. दिल्ली का एक स्टडी विच अ जर्नलिस्ट फ्रॉम द हिंदू डिड, रुक्मिणी एस, you can look for her articles of that study online. She did a series of 3 very good articles on it. And that study showed that an appalling 42% of rape cases that reached the trial courts in Delhi were cases of consensual elopement that had been criminalized by the girl's parents or the girl's family. And they had said it was rape, so you had a rape case there. If you read Pratiksha Bakshi's book on rape trials in Gujarat, then she discusses one case in which a couple, a married couple, actually spent time in jail because not only was the man booked for kidnapping and rape, but the woman was also booked for colluding in her own kidnapping and rape. Okay, so this is bizarre, I know, but you know, this is what is happening. So this is, if there is really an Indian problem, everybody says, you know, is rape an Indian problem? How is rape in India now? Is rape better? Is the situation for rape better in India? And I feel like saying rape is not an Indian problem alone. But if there is something uniquely, especially Indian about the problem or South Asian about the problem, I would say that this is it. That actually, you know, the fact that the differentiation between autonomy, sexual autonomy and sexual violence is actually something which in common sense is much more blurred than probably in other parts of the world. So this is actually something which is our problem here, and this is what we need to talk about. So what happens when you talk about stranger rape is that you are able to not talk about what happened, what is this 42% number that we are seeing on the pages, you know, वो 42% क्या है? अगर 42% cases rape के, वो rape numbers आपको क्या बता रहे हैं? कि if there is such a large number of young women who are running away and from their homes to be in a relationship. Some of those are in intercaste relationships, some of those are in interfaith relationships, some of those are in same-sex relationships. When they are running away to do so, what is that telling us? That is actually another form of violence that is getting named as rape, right? It is actually, it speaks, each of those stories you will find, behind each of those cases will be a story of coercion and violence inside the home. राइट जहाँ पे घर परिवार वाले कहेंगे कि अच्छा तू हमारी बात नहीं मान रही, पहले बोलेंगे बेटा बात मान ले, तू बात नहीं मान रही तो मैं खाना बंद कर देता हूँ, तू तब भी नहीं मान रही तो मैं तेरा खाना बंद कर देता हूँ, तुझे बंद कर देता हूँ, ये तो शुरू होता है. So the fact that there is coercion and violence right there, which can go up till the extent of killing, which can go up till the extent of actually killing the woman as well as killing her partner. This is a violence which gets hidden under the label of rape, right? लेकिन वो जो हिंसा है उसके बारे में बात करने की जगह कहाँ से बनेगी? अगर हम सिर्फ और सिर्फ इसी तरह की हिंसा के बारे में बात करेंगे जो कोई अनजान व्यक्ति हम पर हमला करेगा, कोई अनजान व्यक्ति यौन हिंसा करेगा, उससे हमें अपनी बेटी को बचाना है, उससे हमको महिलाओं को बचाना है, उससे हमको सुरक्षा देना है. तो दरअसल सुरक्षा के नाम पर इनमें से ये जो कोर्जन है, ये जो हिंसा है, ये सुरक्षा के नाम पर ही तो हो रहा है. बिकॉज द पेरेंट्स आर एबल टू से आई एम डूइंग दिस टू प्रोटेक्ट माई डॉटर, मैं तो बच्ची को बचाने के लिए कर रहा हूँ. वो आदमी जो है वो गलत आदमी है, वो मैं नहीं मानता कि उसको शादी करनी चाहिए मेरी बेटी से या प्यार करना चाहिए मेरी बेटी से या जो भी करना चाहिए. अगर वो सेम सेक्स रिलेशनशिप है तो हाय तौबा, वो पता नहीं कौन है, क्या चीज़ है, वो क्या उठा के ले जा रही है हमारी बेटी को. तो हम तो उसको बचा रहे हैं, हम तो इसके भले के लिए कर रहे हैं, नहीं जानती क्या करें. और ये फैमिलीज में हो रहा है एज we can see from the Delhi statistics, and it's also getting a larger organized political dimension across the country and also in certain states in certain specific ways. Take a few examples. If you look at the Cobra Post expose of called Operation Juliet, where they did this sting operation of the Sangh Parivar groups, the RSS groups that are conducting campaigns against love jihad, then they found that in a series of cases, consensual relationships are being branded as love jihad because they're interfaith relationships. A Hindu girl is in love with a Muslim boy, so it would be called love jihad. And I can tell you this from my own experience, that a Hindu girl marrying a Muslim man, even in Delhi, a Hindu woman marrying a Muslim man, even in a Delhi court, they file the application under the Special Marriages Act, and the same night the woman's father gets a phone call saying, do you know that your daughter is marrying a Muslim man? Right? This has happened even in my own knowledge. So this is common. They have people in the courts to keep an eye on these marriages and to create a panic around these kinds of relationships. And what is happening? They're talking quite openly in the sting operation कि अगर लड़की नहीं मान रही, कह रहे पहले तो लड़की को हम समझाते हैं, अब नहीं समझती है तो फिर लड़की तो लड़की है, उसको फट्टे लगाते हैं कि beat her with a board, मारते हैं फट्टे से फट्टे लगाते हैं, खूब जम करके मारते हैं. और तब भी अगर वो नहीं मानती, तब भी if she is still not willing to say, all right, I won't be in this relationship and that man has raped me. If I am unwilling to say it even then, if the woman is unwilling to say it even then they've even talked about sending some of those women off to some places in certain kinds of setups that the RSS has, where they claim that they medicate them, they basically drug them with something in order to brainwash them, in order to change their minds. I don't know how much success they have in that, but it's frightening to think of that happening. So this is happening on a political scale, which is accompanied by this whole thing about protecting women. तो हर तरह के रक्षकों से थोड़ा डर लगना चाहिए, नहीं? गौरक्षा के नाम पे क्या हो रहा है कि गाय को बचाने चले और इंसानों को कत्ल कर दो, मार दो, नंगा करके पैरेड कर दो, नंगा करके पीटो पाटो, सब कुछ करो. और गौरक्षा के नाम पे, प्रोटेक्टिंग काउस के नाम पे, if you have people killing people, Dalits and Muslims in the name of protecting cows, you are also having a lot of violence against women, yes, but also the pretext of love jihad being used as a trigger for violence against the Muslim community, for communal violence, as a justification for communal violence. This happened in Muzaffarnagar, one of the riots that helped Narendra Modi win his election campaign. So the thing here to see is that the entire agenda of even if we fall into the trap of framing the issue as one of protection of women, one of security for women, then it's actually giving fodder to campaigns that are basically fueling violence, not of course against women's autonomy, but also against other communities. In South India, Tamil Nadu, what is now a growing phenomenon is that of certain caste organizations. There are certain middle caste organizations which are actively campaigning on social media as well as more generally against intercaste marriage with Dalits. So a Dalit man who marries, especially a woman from one of the middle castes, they are they're consolidating their political identity by raising the bogey of a sort of love jihad by Dalit men. And you're having a series of instances of violence against Dalit men, against their non-Dalit wives, as well as against Dalit communities to which those men belong. We've seen this for a long time in the Divya Ali Illavarasan case a couple of years ago. More recently on a public street in Tamil Nadu, where CCTV camera on the street captured it, where a young man and his wife who had it was his birthday, and they had gone to buy him a present, to buy him a shirt, and working class young couple, and they had walked out to the main crossroads there, and there were people who came and attacked them on the street and chopped the man to death. The woman was also very grievously injured but survived. and the man was chopped to death right there in the public street, Din Dahade, right there in broad daylight. So there is this kind of political organization also happening around these instances. I am, along with many others, uneasy to use the word honor crimes about this. One of the phrases which we prefer to use is, although it's difficult because that's what they're called in public speak. So in order to be recognized for what it is, sometimes that phrase gets used. But I would say that we should recognize it actually as family custodial killings, and that families are in the custody of the family. The woman is subjected to violence, and it is to regain the custody of the woman and say that we will decide who she will marry, who she will not marry. It is to reassert that custody that the other violence also happens against men whom we don't want to marry or not. So if some of this is happening, I think we also have to recognize that isko badlenge kaise, how to challenge it. Because if you think it's one of the ways in which it's more, as I said, there's more conversation around this now in the media and so on. And in India, the tendency is to talk about this in terms of mindset or in terms of culture. And I would say that even when violence in India is talked about outside, then also there is a tendency to think about this in terms of culture. And I think that we need to problematize this a little bit, because those who inflict that violence are also quite happy to talk about it in terms of culture. तो उस हिंसा को सही ठहराने के लिए जो रेपिस्ट है वो भी कहेगा कि भाई उसने हमारे कल्चर की बातें नहीं मानी, इसलिए मैंने रेप किया. That's his explanation for the rape, to say that, well, why was she out at night, why was she out with the guy, that's why I raped her. Or other forms of violence, of course, जो ये custodial violence है, family custodial violence है, उसको भी लेकर के Indian culture की बातें. Intercaste marriages पर जो हमला है, the organizations I was talking about in Tamil Nadu have given open statements saying that why did Dalit men cross the Lakshman Rekha? If Dalit men had stayed within their boundaries, the boundaries that are set by our culture, then they would not have been killed. It's very unfortunate he was killed, but who told him to cross the line? It's exactly in the way in which it's said about women, who told her to cross the line, she would not be raped otherwise, right? So if that is happening, we need to think about, should we define it only in terms of culture, the problem at the level of mindset, or should we think about what are the structures that are actually enabling this? And I think that, just to give you a couple of examples of why our state, our society, and even family should be looked at not in terms of as a cultural site alone, a private cultural site, where, what can we do? After all, that's culture. It will take centuries to change, etc. But instead to look at the family, at how the family and the state are actually working in tandem. परिवार की संस्था और राज्य की संस्था. When Engels wrote about it, and this is something which I find that even Marxists need a reminder of this sometimes, because to remind that Engels didn't just talk about the state, he talked about the family, state and private property in the same breath. So you will have to start looking at the family also and how it is working in tandem with the state, and how the structures of social reproduction are working, how are these structures required by capital, by the state, and how the family fits into all of this. So I won't go into very many details, but I'll give one example which Balaji also mentioned briefly. But the example of the Tamil Nadu factories, for instance, is an important one. It's not just about sexual violence there, by the way. It is about how, and it's very familiar to anyone, any woman who has lived in a hostel. I'm sure there are several who have come to JNU for the first time to live in a hostel. JNU hostels are a little bit different from that. But I would say if you look at anybody who's lived in a school hostel or a college hostel, women are extremely familiar with this. That the kind of rules that are imposed on women in hostels, right, on women students, कि आपको timings अलग होंगे, बाहर नहीं निकलना है, तो men's hostels timings will be different. There's a wonderful movement against that in Delhi University, the Pinjra Tod movement, which is saying, basically break these barriers. I think that, but to look at it, you have that movement among students, but it's important to recognize, and I find the need to remind this even to people who think that a movement like Pinjra Tod or even the Bake Off Azadi slogan in Delhi in 2016, people look at those slogans and think, all right, urban women, it's an elite issue. I've been asked this question even by some leading feminist scholars who've asked me this repeatedly, trying to get it out of me to say, well, say it's elite, And I said, I don't think so. I don't think of these issues as being only the issues of a certain section of society. I don't think so at all. I don't agree. So I can't say to fit a script. I can't. And one of the things I thought of and I've talked about is that when you look at the way in which there are in the Tamil Nadu factories, garment factories, even in Karnataka, some places, you have women from rural areas being very young women being brought for a certain time period. Say 18-year-old women will work till they are 21, 22, 23, not more than that. So you bring them for that period and you are recruiting them in large numbers to work in the factory, and you don't want them to work there after that. So you want them to work for that period. So one of the ways in which this work was achieved, this labor was achieved, was by calling it the Sumangali scheme. Now that name has become a little embarrassing, so they've gotten away from it. Sumangali in Tamil is a word for the auspicious married woman. So somebody who is a Sumangali is someone who is married, who wears the tali, the Mangal Sutra. She's a married woman. She has the marks of being married. She is auspicious, as opposed to the Amangali who is unmarried or who is inauspicious, right? So the Sumangali scheme of recruiting young women was called the Sumangali scheme, which meant that you will work there for 3 years. We won't pay you a monthly salary or a fixed salary. We will pay you a lump sum amount at the end of the 3 years that you will work there. That will be your dowry. So families were told that their women are earning their dowry. It's great. They would be working in your fields, and then you would get them married, and you would have to put together dowry. Now, instead of working in the fields, many of them are Dalit women, a very large number of them are Dalit women. So instead of working there, let them work in the factory with us for 3 years, and don't worry. Are you worried that if they go away from your family custody, then they might fall in love with the wrong guy, they might, start having a relationship and, do whatever, go out of your control? Don't worry. We'll do all that policing for you. We are going to keep them in a hostel, and they will not be allowed to have any mobile phone. They will not be allowed to speak to anybody. They will be allowed to make one weekly phone call home so that you can check on their well-being. But don't worry, we will have a warden there who will ensure that they're not talking to anybody, they're not anybody. So this is actually, and this part of it, the Sumangali name is gone, but all the structure of policing the women workers in that factory are still in place. And why are they doing it? If you ask them why you're doing it, the studies on this, invariably the answer is if this is Tamil culture, and families won't allow the women to work with us without, it's Tamil culture, kya kare? Now my point is that this is very it's an ingenious way of putting it, right? It's a way of saying what to do, family culture, Tamil culture, what can I do? I'm neutral, I'm capital, I'm here in a completely neutral capacity, and I take what I get, and this is the culture I'm getting, that's how I get labor. That's not how it works, right? Think of it when it comes to education also. People do want women to work, people do want women to study. That is a need, that's a felt need now. The point is, if your structures of education or work, the workplace or the place of education is not going to mirror, the custodial structures of the home and even tighten them beyond the home. Because inside the home there is still more space, right, for rebellion, because it's not that well organized. Those structures, there are cracks in those structures of the home. But when it is solidified in the hostel or in the factory, then it becomes an entirely different matter. And what you are doing it for then, in the name of culture, is to prevent women from, of course, from exercising their sexual autonomy, but equally so from exercising their political autonomy. And that goes for women students, and it goes for women in factories. Because वो उस mobile phone का करेगी क्या? What will that woman do with the mobile phone? Of course, she may get a boyfriend and talk to him on the mobile phone. But she may also talk to her colleagues, she may also talk to people in other factories, she may also talk to male and female colleagues across other factories, she may talk to union leaders, she might unionize herself, she might become a union leader. These are the things that you really don't want happening, and that is what you are preventing by invoking certain, as though you're helpless in the face of patriarchal culture. Kya kare? It's there. There's nothing I can do about it, right? And I think that is where, when Balaji mentioned those things being said about JNU, I mean, so those of you who are new at JNU, I suppose you must be still looking for kahan hai, nanga naach kahan ho raha hai, where's all that naked dance happening? Not happening. It's wrongly advertised. Where is it? So the thing is that, the point is that the spectre of the free woman, the spectre of someone who is not within those bounds, it's not just about it's not only a question of personal autonomy. It is that, of course, but it is also threatening to all the structures of oppression and repression that we have, that keep in place those structures of caste and class and exploitation of gendered labor and caste assigned labor and so on. All those structures get threatened by the spectre of a free woman, which is why you have, Sangh Parivar people also saying, and it's not only the Sangh, this fear, this anxiety goes much beyond it. But the Sangh is one of the most, you can say, one of the most best formulated sort of theoretical expressions, political expressions of this patriarchy. So you've had Sangh leaders, Babu Bajrangi, who raped and killed so many women in Gujarat in 2002, Muslim women. He had said in an interview he said that in every home, Hindu home, there is a bomb. Your daughter, she's a bomb. She could explode any minute. You better, police that border damn carefully because she's a bomb. If she falls in love with the wrong guy, your home is going to explode. Our caste system will explode. Our Hindu culture will explode. So it's an interesting analogy that he used, but it does reflect that kind of complete fear and anxiety of the free woman. So I was thinking that if we were to think about what implications this has for politics, because now we've started talking about how political groups are theorizing this. But I would say that there also, let's go a little beyond the BJP for now, because of course in the context of the BJP you've seen all of this, Balaji also mentioned it, you see these slogans of empowerment, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. But at the same time, जहाँ बेटी पढ़ने आ रही है, JNU में या जादवपुर में, तो वहाँ कहोगे कि ये सब तो गिरी हुई लड़कियाँ हैं, लूज हैं, the woman student especially is seen as someone who's a source of danger. The woman who is outside the confines of the home and strict surveillance is somebody who's a danger. So put in place surveillance, all that surveillance, all those CCTV cameras and all that cameras that they want to record us here, they're not going to, it is of course political surveillance, but political surveillance is very closely linked always with gendered surveillance as well. And it's the same case here as well. So the thing here is कि वो बेटी पढ़ने आएगी, so you will say that the woman student in JNU or Jadavpur is somewhere sexually loose and uncontrolled and she wants free sex and so on and so forth. So, so why exactly is this happening? It's something we need to think about. And I would like to take the discussion a little broader than the BJP, because I think it's important to do so. I would say that our entire political discourse, because it is still easy for politicians across the board to talk about issues of gender primarily in terms of protection of women from stranger sexual violence. And so they're able to get away really cheaply by making some statements now and then about, if it's a rape that has happened in an opposition state, then you can say, hang the rapist, kill him publicly, this, that and the other. You had an AAP politician do that very recently, the culture minister of the Aam Aadmi Party, who is an ex-Amnesty International guy or whatever. He said, when I was in Amnesty, I was against the death penalty, but now I'm a politician, so now I'm for the death penalty. I want, rapists to be hung, drawn and quartered or whatever it is in public and all of that. So the point is, this is really cheap rhetoric, because you're able to do this while not actually putting your money where it should go, investing public funds where they should be, where women are actually making a claim on those public funds in so many various ways, be it maternity entitlements, be it shelters for women, be it investing in more judges and more courts and so on, so that cases can move faster. None of that is happening. So you're able to talk about it in this way and get away with it. And the other thing that is happening is, and if it happens in your own state, then from Mamata Banerjee to Azam Khan, everybody can say something, some variant of Shahjano Ghatna, right? So it's a cooked up thing. It's a fake case, and the opposition is cooking it up in order to, make us look bad, whatever it is. And I think that they're also able to move away from actually talking about structures that keep sexual violence in place, right? So one of the examples of that, which I thought I would talk about today, is that if you look at how talking about protecting women, they also talk about protecting the country, which is seen as a woman. So you say Bharat Mata ko bachana, and of course the BJP is actually beating up people for not saying Bharat Mata ki jai, but it isn't only the BJP. The point is that the country the nation as a woman whom we respect, we protect and avenge. You protect her and you avenge her in wars or in certain forms of violence and so on. In certain kinds of policing, certain kinds of conflict situations, you're avenging and protecting the mother nation is something which is commonly seen, right? You have Smriti Irani today going to tie Rakhi to the army guys. What is that saying? It's essentially saying these are the men, these are the sons of the nation who are protecting the nation. The point is that then violence that is done in the name of the nation, violence that is done by people in uniform, and which is then, it becomes something that you're not allowed to talk about. It becomes seditious to talk about violence that is committed in the name of the nation. You can't talk about it. And the very fact that so much of this violence is also then protected. It is happening in the name of the nation. It's happening in the name of protecting Bharat Mata. And after that, it is also, there's these structures of impunity are in place. AFSPA is just one of those structures. It isn't only the AFSPA. But basically you're saying that then we will not prosecute. We can't afford to demoralize the army or demoralize the police or whatever it is by admitting that these are institutions that rely on sexual violence in order to keep control on certain sections of people, right? So this is the case in Bastar. I visited Bastar a couple of months ago, and the scale of sexual violence there, the scale of gendered violence there, where not only sexual violence, rape of course, but also killing 13-year-old, 14-year-old little girls and saying they were women Maoists who were killed in an encounter. So you meet their parents and they say these are 13 and 14-year-old little girls who had gone out early morning to have a bath and they never came back. So this is the kind of violence that is happening. And in the Northeast, you think about it. I mean, because the kind of impatience there is in certain kinds of rape cases. I find that really amusing. That when certain media channels would go on about certain cases and say, why hasn't justice already been done? Why haven't we seen a couple of people already hanged or killed or whatever it is? Do something. And yet, in a case like the Tanjam Manorama rape case, right? I take that as one instance. Of course, there are many others, but I take that as one instance because that is one instance in which the movement actually resulted in a judicial inquiry commission that brought out a report that indicted the Assam Rifles Jawans and said that they picked up this young woman from her home when she was in her home. They picked her up in front of her family. Her family is witness to that. She was sexually tortured. She was very brutally tortured, and then she was killed. And then to get rid of the evidence of having gang raped her, bullets were pumped into her private parts as well. Now, in what possible way is this less brutal than whatever has happened in Delhi on 16 December or what happened in Bulandshahr, or whatever it is? The cases which public discourse is comfortable talking about. But why is it then that you aren't allowed to talk about 2004, you're not allowed to talk about Tanjung Balli? Why is it that you're not allowed to talk about the Kunan Poshpora villages in Kashmir, where 2 entire villages of women got raped and no one has even been prosecuted? People say, oh, where are the courts? The courts haven't said it yet. You say, well, the courts haven't said it because the accused have not yet been able to be brought to court. So how are the courts supposed to say whether rape took place or not took place? You're not allowing even a trial to take place, right? So you have this kind of situation, and it goes a little more than that. when we were talking about Kashmir, the kind of violence we've been witnessing in Kashmir, Suchita is here, and I remember that she had written on Facebook something remembering that song कि वो डर वाला जो गाना है ना, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू है मेरी, हाँ, तो वो तो किरण थी, ये कश्मीर हो गई, ठीक है। तो ये लिखा, ये बिल्कुल सही बात है कि वो जो एक किस्म की ऑब्सेसिव लव है, भी प्रधानमंत्री ने नहीं कहा कि हम तो प्यार करते हैं, हर भारतवासी प्यार करता है कश्मीर से, every Indian loves Kashmir, says the Prime Minister in a speech in Madhya Pradesh. And yet it's a kind of love that is able to live with a whole lot of violence, and it's actually not, it shouldn't surprise us. And if you thought that the domestic violence or the stalking analogy was a little weird and a little off, and it's only these mad Naxalites who are doing it, pause a minute. The CRPF is doing it as well. It's not my analogy, it's an analogy the CRPF is using in Kashmir. So the CRPF chief in Kashmir, when he is asked by the Dainik Bhaskar reporter, when are you going to stop using pellet guns in Kashmir? What does he answer? He says, oh, this is like asking me when am I going to stop beating my wife. He said it. So it is actually an analogy that is not alien, not used by us alone. It's absolutely the way in which, and to my mind, that's what it is, right? I mean, whether you see it as an analogy of stalking, an analogy of domestic violence against the woman in an unhappy relationship, or someone who wants to assert her autonomy and you won't let her, look at it any which way. If you're going to visualize the nation as a woman, let's remember how we treat women in this country. Let's remember how we treat actual living flesh and blood women in this country, and be sure that we are also treating parts of the country that we are claiming as our own in pretty much the same way. And bludgeoning people and killing them and so on is perfectly all right, because well, it's perfectly all right to do it to save the structure of the family, right? And the other way in which politics talks about these things is also in terms of the way in which the family is involved. That's also another very interesting thing. If you look at it, abhi child labor wala amendments passed. Look at the way in which the family is invoked as a way to justify child labor. So to say that there are certain forms of child labor will be allowed because they are child labor that is happening within the ambit of the family. This is something like, dekh lijiye ki, I find it interesting that the RSS talks about, RSS chief said in some speech some time back, we are not feminists, we are familiists. So that isn't really, that's a very telling term. And as I said, the RSS is the foremost theoretical expression of this kind of Savarna, Hindutva kind of patriarchy. But it isn't the only one by a long way. And if you look at how, the RSS of course invokes the family in many contexts. Look at the Ghar Wapsi. तो घर के अंदर महिलाएं कुछ ना बोलेंगे, यहाँ दीक्षित की स्टोरी तो देख लो, holier than cow, not just her latest story on the abduction of Adivasi girls from Assam, but an earlier story that she had done on the Rashtra Sevika Samiti, where she talked about how the Rashtra Sevika Samiti women tell women who come to them complaining of domestic violence that it's within the family, you have to put up with it. You're not allowed to wash your dirty linen outside the family. तो उसी वो घर महिलाओं के लिए क्या है वो तो साफ है, लेकिन घर वापसी, come back to the house, homecoming for the Dalits as well. So a certain kind of caste and gender equation is very firmly in place when you're talking about the RSS family. And if you look at the BJP manifesto for 2014 elections, you'll find it online, you can look at it. It talks also about the industry family. So it says that we want workers and industrialists to resolve things within the industry family, which means that if the industry and the workplace is a family, तो उसके अंदर तो यूनियन क्या बनेगी, उसके अंदर सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट एट वर्कप्लेस एक्ट क्या लागू होगा, फैमिली के अंदर तो फैमिली है ना, उसके अंदर ये सब नहीं लागू होना चाहिए, तो ये तो बाहर रहेगा फैमिली के. Now, how do we take this on? How do we challenge this? And I think that the real challenge here is how to develop a political idiom that is actually able to take this on. And for that, I think that we also need to do things that are not very simple and not easily, not packaged and available very quickly. Let me give you one instance. when the state also, you can be very suspicious when the state talks about empowering or uplifting women, because women's empowerment and women's liberation is not going to happen via the state. You can make claims on the state. You must make claims on the state and on the state's funds, because those are public funds. You can make claims on the state, you make demands on the state, but you have to know that liberation is not going to come through something the state has done. And one of the examples that struck me is look at how the French state, for instance, let's take the example away from India for a minute. I'll come back to India with the next example. If you look at how France is approaching the question of women's equality. Now, France has declared some years back a ban on the burqa. And recently, in an even more absurd step, Muslim women who were going to the beach and having a good time, wearing what the media was calling a burkini, but basically which was a covered dress. It was a fully covered swimsuit, basically. It's a swimsuit that covers the body. And they said, no, you can't do that. You will be fined if you come to the beach wearing that dress. If you have to come to the beach, you have to wear a swimsuit or wear a bikini of the kind which other women are wearing. Now, discussing this on social media, I'm struck by the large number of people. Of course, you have the Islamophobic vision which says that, oh, they could hide a gun or whatever it is in a bikini, which is like ridiculous. I said, so what are you going to say when my grandmother went to Australia and was asked to go to the beach? The first day she went to the beach, she went in her 9-yard sari, and she thought, okay, I can go in that. Huh? So what are you going to say? Oh, she must be hiding a gun under that sari. She can't go and have fun on the beach because of what she has grown up wearing. So in what way is that possibly empowering? And it's terribly Islamophobic. There's also something else there. You find a lot of people saying, but the burqa is something that is oppressive. And I said that, look, anything that is imposed is oppressive, true. But the point is that especially when you're talking about clothes, dress, a lot of things, I think the things are much more complicated. Much of what we wear, much of what we do, none of us can say we are holier than thou, we're completely free from patriarchal pressures in what we wear. So much of what we wear could be to some extent defined by patriarchal compulsions or patriarchal pressures. None of us can be absolutely sure कि नहीं भाई हम जो भी पहन रहे हैं, जैसे कपड़े पहन रहे हैं, दुपट्टा लगा रही हूँ या लिपस्टिक पहन रही हूँ या कुछ कर रही हूँ, तो वो मैं पसंद से कर रही हूँ, अच्छा लग रहा है, रंग इसलिए पहना, या कहीं ना कहीं मेरे अंदर है कि ऐसे कपड़े पहनने चाहिए इस ओकेजन के लिए या इस चीज़ के लिए, क्योंकि इट्स एक्सपेक्टेड, सोसाइटी एक्सपेक्ट्स मी टू. I really don't get it. Why a bikini, the expectation of a bikini on the beach is not patriarchal and the expectation of a burkini on the beach is patriarchal. It's ridiculous. And the best person to have articulated this, a lovely articulation of this, is actually the Iranian-born cartoonist Marjan Satrapi, who now lives in France. When she was 14, she escaped from Iran and she went to live in France. So she's written these wonderful cartoon autobiographies which are wonderful. And she's written other stuff also about her, her home in Iran and so on, which are great. But when she was asked about the burqa ban in France some years ago, she said, look, I know that if you tell a teenage girl that something is banned and she's not supposed to do it, that's precisely the thing she's going to want to do. So, to my mind, it's absolutely ridiculous, even if you don't want women wearing burqas, to tell women that the burqa has been banned, and you tell teenage girls the burqa has been banned, is a way of saying, all right, they're going to do it all the way. And she also said that, look, you have to understand that women whose mothers were not wearing it, but the younger generation today is wearing it, is not only because there is some kind of diktat or Islamophobic diktat, that could be part of it, but it's also because living in France, in the country where they've come from, the mother might have given it up. But in this country, it's a way of asserting your identity, especially in the face of Islamophobia. It's a way of asserting your identity. So, I don't think, when we work among women in India, is it possible for me to say when I work among Hindu women that as a mark of your feminism, you have to give up the sindoor? You haven't given up your sindoor, oh, you can't be a member of our organization. Can we do that? It's absolutely ridiculous. You can't do that. Of course, the sindoor has all sorts of patriarchal implications. But at the end of the day, it is a woman's decision what she does. I have seen women in the Wazirpur industrial area coming out for rallies for the first time, trying to manage so that their head is covered because they're walking in public, alright? After some time, after several times of those rallies, you find that then the consideration has become that I want to hold up a placard. And if I'm holding up a placard, I can't possibly be bothered about whether my head is covered or not. So at some point, I've forgotten about it. At some point, I've started giving speeches and I've stopped bothering about it. If it happens that way, that's another thing. But if some woman feels it is part of her assertion of her identity, because for instance, I attended a conference of Muslim women some months back in Delhi. Very, very inspiring conference of Muslim women fighting patriarchy within their community as well as more generally in India. And one of the things a young woman said there was very interesting. She said, I can live my life, I can tell myself that I am dressing and living as though I am not Muslim. Right? I can say I don't believe in Islam, I'm secular, I don't really believe in religion very much. But that doesn't change the fact that I will be seen as Muslim and treated as Muslim by others. And when I realized that, I decided that I might want to assert some of that identity and say that I do belong to this identity. कर लो जो करना है, मैं हूँ मुस्लिम, ठीक है? ये जो इच्छा है, उसको भी आपको रेस्पेक्ट करना होगा. तो मुझे लगता है कि स्टेट आइडिया कि स्टेट जो है वो सेक्युलरिज्म ला देगी या विमेंस लिबरेशन ला देगी इन द वे इन विच France is approaching it, and increasingly some other parts of Europe are beginning to approach it, is actually extremely dangerous. Now if you look at it in the Indian context also, I'll just take one example and that will be my last, then we can open it up for questions. But look at how sex-selective abortion has been done. Recently there's been a study by the AIMS that showed that there's a disproportionate sex-selective abortion and female infanticide in South Delhi, which is one of the posher areas of Delhi. South Delhi is one of the worst areas for this kind of thing. Now, in the whole rhetoric around the Beti Bachao rhetoric, what was being implied, I don't mean it only in the Prime Minister's speech, but more generally in where that Beti Bachao slogan came from. Beti Bachao was a campaign, and the Selfie with Daughter campaign were campaigns that originated in a village in Haryana, where during the 2014 elections and during the assembly elections in Haryana, that village had said there was an organization of unmarried men, that said that they raised the slogan Selfie with Daughter and Beti Bachao, and they said Beti Bachao Bahu Lao. So bring the daughter-in-law and save the daughter. And they demanded that the government should take measures to ensure that women be born. Why? Because they are entitled to wives. So it is, you are projecting the entire thing from the angle of male entitlement and not from the angle of women's assertion and women's autonomy and women's right to live. Right. So that wasn't where it was being approached for. So the woman who was born, and I know at my cost, because when I had written about that campaign, I had people tweeting at me saying, if a woman is going to be born and grow up to be like you, then it's better she be killed at birth. Because she is going to demand free sex and she's going to do whatever, she's going to be this feminist or whatever it is, all the abuse that can be heard at you. And you're told that, women should be born only if they're going to be the kind of daughters which we would like, and if we can be entitled to have them for wives. Not only that, what was really, really disturbing to me to read about the campaign in that village against sex-selective abortion was that older women in the village were being recruited to conduct surveillance on pregnant mothers. So there was a complete tight surveillance happening, and you have to watch and make sure and keep giving guilt trip her that if the child is killed, then paap lagega, tumne murder kiya hai, वगैरह. And I felt that women in the marital home who have been married and the new brides in the marital home, they as it is have no control over their sexuality, over their very little control over their sexuality, their fertility, their choice to give birth to, not to give birth to, whatever, and their labor, all of that is under surveillance and control. And any kind of raising your voice against that is being seen as a misuse of the 498A, misuse of the Domestic Violence Act, etc. Will the answer to that be more surveillance and more control? Surely the answer has to lie in more autonomy for the woman inside her household. And that is something nobody is willing to address. No Prime Minister is going to make a speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort saying that women's autonomy inside their own homes. To marry who they like, to live their lives as they like, to not do certain kinds of labor. I wait for the day when just as the Dalits of Una have said we're not going to do certain kinds of labor because we are born into this, that we're not going to do it. I really wait for the day when you will have a situation where women also say, just because we are born women, certain kinds of labor are not our job. You do it if it needs doing. I'm not going to do it. But the point is that nobody is going to say that. Political discourse is shaped such that it is not. This is something that cannot be spoken. This is not going to be spoken. And I think there that to talk about these forms of violence and to talk about these kinds of oppression, these structures of oppression, we need to develop a new political idiom, and we need to put the autonomy of women at the center of that. We need to call out different forms of entitlement. If Dalit women are raped in the fields because the feudal lord thinks that the feudal owner of the land or the dominant caste then thinks that they are entitled to the sexual, to the bodies of the Dalit women. And if the women rebel against those assigned roles and they challenge that entitlement, you have stripping and parading. Stripping and parading of men at Una, stripping and parading of men and women is a particular form of caste violence which is rampant in India. And that's something to recognize. So that is one form of entitlement. But the teacher in a university or a college or the boss in a workplace who thinks that a student or a younger colleague or somebody that they have a right to to ignore consent and demand sexual favors is also coming from a place of patriarchal entitlement. People in uniform are seeing themselves as being entitled to sexual violence without consequences, right? These are different kinds of entitlement. Even the entitlement of the man who thinks that he is entitled to a wife, and the wife is somebody, there are families, surely, जो say कि बेटा शादी कर ले रोटी बनाएगी ना आकर के मेरे लिए रोटी बनाएगी, वो अगर शादी करेगी तो घर में आके रोटी बनाएगी. So the sense of entitlement that the bride or the daughter-in-law or the wife is somebody who performs certain kinds of labor, and to which you are entitled. All these are entitlements that we have to call out. I'll end my talk there and we can open it up for questions.